We all know right now, to bring you to the current topic or the current reality, the Western resource economy has taken a bit of a hit, and oil and gas are examples of that. But this is not the first time, of course, right? This is not the first time the West has encountered this. I moved to Alberta in 1988, and we've been here before. What's the reality on the ground, though, the boom and bust, bust and boom, over the last 4 decades, 3 decades for now? Well, I do a lot of number crunching in my day job, so let me give you a few numbers to illustrate how I think we've been fine in the past, relatively fine, and I think there are reasons why we'll be fine in the future. Take a look at unemployment rates over the past 3 decades, and we'll take a look at the working age population, which for some strange reason Statistics Canada defines as beginning at age 15, but 15 to 64. The unemployment rate in Saskatchewan has actually been in the lowest in the country over this period, the last 3 decades, just over 6%. Alberta's about 7%. These are annual averages now, annual averages from the last 30 years. 7% in Alberta, just under that. And you go to Ontario, close to 8%, British Columbia, 9% over the last 3 decades. That's the annual average. In Quebec, over 10%. Now, unemployment rates, of course, can be lower if you've got a great out-migration, and that's been the case with Saskatchewan. So that explains Saskatchewan's relatively low unemployment rate compared to other provinces over the past couple of decades. However, in fact, Saskatchewan has lost on a net basis about 110,000 people interprovincial migration. Until very recently, they've turned it around in about the last 5 or 10 years, stabilized migration rates. Young adults in particular and others are staying in Saskatchewan because the jobs have been there. Now, that's Saskatchewan, though, and it explains their low unemployment. Let's go to Ontario, though, now. And again, remember what I'm trying to communicate or trying to emphasize is the relative prosperity or attraction of the jurisdiction over the last couple of decades and why I think we'll be fine. Ontario has attracted about 50-some thousand people on a net basis from other provinces since 1982. Quebec has lost 240,000 people since 1982. There's not a single year since the beginning of these statistics, looking back to 1982, that Quebec has had a net positive migration from other provinces. They've been losing people, bleeding people forever. And of course, we know the reasons. Politics in Quebec, separatist politics, some fairly high tax rates, if you want to get into that, and other reasons. But that's Quebec. British Columbia, and again, remember we're just talking about working age folk now, not retirees. British Columbia has attracted 260,000 people in the last 30 years. Alberta, though, some of you who lived here in the 1980s will recall it was a bit of a tough decade. Alberta lost a lot of people in the 1980s, 80,000 people. But over the last 30 years, we've gained 340,000 people, even with that decline in the 1980s. Think about that in comparison to Ontario. 50,000 people migrated to Ontario from other provinces on a net basis. 340,000 to Alberta. So it tells you something about the opportunities here. Okay, well, why is that? It's not just because we have nice, mountains you can hike in and get a good vista from fairly quickly. Go up to Yamista, get a quick view of the prairies and the Rockies. It's not just that. You need to, feed your kids, make a living, all of that. Well, policies matter. Very briefly, I'm from British Columbia. I remember in the late 1970s when then Premier Bill Bennett started to deal with budget problems, probably about 13, 14 years before Alberta ever did. And he really worked hard to get British Columbia in a competitive place and did so. I won't bore you with the details, but British Columbia really struggled. Remember that in British Columbia there was very much a heavy left-wing element that would like to nationalize everything, including mining and energy companies. This was the 1970s. Well, Bill Bennett fought against that and did some good work. Then Alberta, 1990s, you know that there were some tough budget years here, and we might be back there. And remember why? Because I think it's important to point this out. Ralph Klein did a superb job, and his finance minister, Jim Dinning, did a superb job of getting Alberta finances back on track. But remember why it was necessary. If you go back to 1995, you'll find that the amount of money spent on debt interest in this province was more than all of the money spent on social services in that year and in the surrounding years. It was equivalent to almost half of the healthcare budget. Today, that figure would be about close to $8 billion. Imagine if we were spending $8 billion in the province of Alberta today on debt interest, right? Almost half the healthcare budget. People would go, we need to deal with it. So The 1990s were a decade of reform, and next door in Saskatchewan, Roy Romanow, an NDP premier, also sort of grasped the budget and made some important changes. Now, those are the bare facts. And what's my point here? Well, my point is that in Western Canada, you saw premiers across the three Western provinces over the last 3 or 4 decades deal with difficult problems sooner rather than later. We didn't wait until 2015 like Greece, or the Canadian equivalent, Ontario. Ontario has some challenges, and I don't think they're dealing with it. But they dealt with this. And in short, again, think about the big picture here. Despite oil prices that have gone up and down, deeply down, oil and natural gas prices, which were as high as $13 a gigajoule a couple of years ago, and now we're down to $2. Despite these fluctuations, Ontario and Quebec have never matched the kind of private sector investment you will see in the West. Even together, last year, Ontario and Quebec alone didn't have the kind of private sector investment that Alberta did. Now, this may change a little bit this year, but even on a per-person basis, the most important measurement, per-worker basis, in the last 20 years, Ontario and Quebec have never matched the private sector investment in Alberta, British Columbia, or Saskatchewan. All three provinces have trumped Ontario and Quebec. Now, I'm not saying that in a triumphalist tone. I really hope, and a lot of my writing these days is geared towards Central Canada and Atlantic Canada, trying to get them to think differently about policy and put in reform so they too can prosper. Because I don't think it's going to happen automatically. But insofar as we're talking about the West, I am encouraged because the basic policies and ideas are there. And we've gotten the basics right in Western Canada more often than not. And that's why we've been prosperous, and that's why I think we'll be prosperous again in the future, despite the decline that we're seeing this year. Let me turn back to, though, and end with the Western narrative once again. And I want to end with historian James McGregor again, whose words I mentioned at the start. Here's how he describes Alberta in one passage of his 1972 book. My Alberta is a magnificent land, a magic land. The seasons transform spring's new leaves to fall's blaze of gold, always ending in a shelter of winter's pine forests. For me, no other land can match its rugged grandeur or rival its hold on the heartstrings. Not only is it beautiful, he writes, from sage-scented cypress hills to the spruce-forested Caribou Mountains, but each of its valleys, hills, and mountain passes is steeped in history. The history of men following their fortunes to Alberta. Let me repeat that. Steeped in history of men following their fortunes to Alberta. Of course, if he was writing today, he would say men and women. But you get the point. Indeed, Alberta is that, and I would argue Western Canada is that as well. Let's remember what creates a narrative. What creates the stories we tell about ourselves? Well, nature, events, and our choices, our responses to nature and to events. Whether one looks at the dry facts of policy decisions, or, if you want to take a shortcut to optimism, simply by drenching yourself in Western poems and Western stories and in the Western literature, the Western narrative, Westerners have always done what it takes to be successful. They're always interested in making this corner of the world a success in every way. This legendary natural optimism is a big part of our self-understanding and of our narrative, and it's a big part of who we are as Westerners. Our future is bright. Thank you.